heard her before I saw her. A woman's voice where no woman could be, singing a snatch of some half-remembered hymn in a tongue I almost knew. The night air in the Colombian selva had turned strangely cold, the cicadas fallen silent, our fire guttered as if pressed upon by an unseen hand. Then the song broke into a wet, tearing sob, and something with only 1 foot stepped into the lantern light. Men have pressed me, in clubs and drawing rooms, to set this down as faithfully as memory allows, though I sometimes doubt the wisdom of troubling the present with such shadows. If you wish to hear more of these old journeys, lend your approval and say in the comments which path you would have chosen and whether such tales have reached your own hearth. To understand what we met in those forests, I must return to the year 1913 and to the Magdalena River, swollen and the colour of tea. I was then 30 years of age, in the employ of the Royal Geographical Society, attached to a small Anglo-Colombian survey charged with charting timber concessions in the upper Putumayo. Rubber, mahogany and quinine had drawn the attention of London and Bogotá alike. I believed, as did most of my class, that there was no corner of the globe which could not be measured, named and rendered harmless by inclusion on a proper map. We began at Honda in late June, when the river mist hung low and the rains were said to be easing. Our party numbered 6 Europeans and 8 local men. There was Captain Edward Henderson, formerly of the Indian Army, who commanded the expedition. Dr. Lionel Marsh, a naturalist of some repute. Myself, Arthur Lennox, in charge of survey instruments and records. Young Mr. Wilkes, who managed provisions, and 2 Colombian officials, Senor Valdez and his assistant, Ruiz, there to represent concession interests. Our local men were a mixture of mestizo boatmen and 2 Cofan guides, brothers named Mateo and Isidro. Our equipment was typical of such undertakings: 2 theodolites in brass, a box sextant, compasses, aneroid barometers, canvas tents, kerosene lanterns, bolt-action rifles, machetes, and enough tinned beef, hard biscuit and coffee to sustain us 3 months. We had brought also a phonograph of Henderson's, a ridiculous luxury in my view, but one he insisted would raise spirits during the long, wet evenings. We travelled by river launch as far as Puerto Asís, then exchanged the relative comfort of the boat for dugout canoes, and, beyond that, for our own blistered feet. The selva closed around us like a living thing. Vines hung in festoons, tree trunks steamed, and the air never cooled, only shifted from the heat of day to the suffocating damp of night. The forest's sound was constant: insects shrilling, monkeys bickering in the canopy, the distant cough of jaguar, and always the drip of unseen water. Those first days were marked by the ordinary difficulties of such work: leeches, fever, boots rotting at the seams. We cut a narrow trail with machetes, marking trees with paint and notation for later survey. Marsh busied himself with specimens, his pockets bulging with beetles and seeds. Henderson maintained a brisk pace and a stricter discipline. At night, we set camp on the driest ground we could find, hung hammocks between trees, and strung a ring of lanterns and smouldering fires as protection against beasts. The first anomaly was so slight that I would not have recalled it, had not all that followed given it a darker cast. It occurred on the 4th night, when we had left the last known rubber trail and were pushing into less travelled country, guided by the Cofan brothers' quiet assurance. Around midnight, as I lay in my hammock, half asleep, I became aware that the forest's chorus had thinned. The frogs ceased their frantic croaking. The insects' shrillness softened as if muffled by some invisible curtain. In their place, I heard, very faintly, what I took at first for a distant woman's laughter. I remember propping myself upon one elbow, listening. It came again, a light chiming sound, like glass tapped gently, then something that might have been words. I thought of a camp of rubber tappers, or perhaps some missionary outpost hidden in the trees. It made no sense, of course. We were many miles beyond any such settlement. I almost called out to Henderson, but the sound dwindled and the frogs resumed their din. I told myself I had dreamt it, or that some bird had produced a call that mimicked the human voice. Had I understood then that the forest sometimes falls silent, not from rest, but from attention, I might have woken the others and demanded we move camp. Instead, I turned in my hammock and slept. The next morning, as we broke camp, I mentioned the curious silence to Marsh while he wrapped a specimen in paper. "Some owls will stop the frogs for a time," he said, not looking up. "The smaller creatures know when a predator is abroad. As for your laughing woman Lennox, I suspect you were dreaming of some girl in Kent." He smiled thinly. The jungle plays tricks on the ear. By the second week, we had left even the Kofan's familiar paths. The brothers consulted the sun and the flow of small streams, murmuring to one another in their own tongue. But they grew more taciturn. Once, at a bend in a creek where the water had taken on an oily sheen, Mateo halted and spoke sharply to Henderson. "He says, 'We go near a place the people fear,'" translated Ruiz. "A place where the forest eats men who are not careful." Henderson laughed. "The forest eats careless men everywhere. Tell him we are careful and that we pay well." Ruiz relayed this. Mateo's jaw tightened. He said something else, more quietly. "What now?" asked Henderson. "He says there is a woman in the forest," said Ruiz, clearly uncomfortable. Temptress. A spirit that lures men from the path. He says she walks on one leg and that her foot is a hoof. It is an old story." Marsh snorted. "La Patasola," he said. "I have heard such tales in Peru, the one-footed harlot." He glanced at me. "Every land has its bogey. In England we have black dogs. Here they have limping women." I confess that I smiled then, as one does at the fancies of the less enlightened. The notion of a one-legged forest siren seemed no more plausible than the tales of sea serpents that sailors still told in ports. Yet I noticed that our Kofan guides crossed themselves in a fashion I had not seen before, touching brow, chest, and then their lips. That night provided the human moment that has stayed with me most keenly, perhaps because of the cruel contrast with what followed. We had made camp upon a small rise above a sluggish stream. The day's march had been long, and the men were in low spirits. Henderson, sensing this, ordered the phonograph unpacked. Soon the thin, reedy strains of a waltz spilled absurdly into the humid dark. We sat around the central fire, the lanterns throwing our shadows against the trees. Marsh produced a tin of tobacco he had been hoarding and passed it round. Young Wilkes, who had spoken little since we left the river, stared into the flames until I asked him, half teasing, what he would do when we returned to civilization. He hesitated, then said, "My sister is to be married in December, in Sussex. I have promised to be there." He smiled, a shy, boyish expression that sat oddly with the grime upon his face. "She has chosen a church near the Downs. There is a yew tree in the churchyard that is older than the conquest, or so my father says. I mean to see it again." "Then you shall," said Henderson briskly. "We will have our lines drawn and our reports written well before then. You shall go home with tales of savage splendor to impress the ladies." Wilkes laughed, and for a moment the forest seemed almost companionable. The Kofan men listened to the waltz with solemn expressions. Mateo said something to Isidro, who replied in a low tone. Ruiz, catching my glance, said, "He says the music will wake the ones who sleep between the trees." I thought he meant jaguars, and chose not to translate this for Henderson, who would only have scoffed. The phonograph crackled, the record ended, and the jungle's own music swelled back as if in answer. The next sign came 2 days later. We had risen before dawn to avoid the worst of the heat and were following a narrow animal track when Isidro halted, raising his hand. We gathered round. In the soft mud beside the path there was a single, clear impression. At first I took it for the track of some ungulate. It was cloven, like that of a deer or small tapir, but narrower, and the depth of it suggested a weight greater than its size implied. What arrested me was not the track itself, but the fact that there was only one. No preceding print, no following one, no parallel line of a second foot. Just that one, pressed deep, the edges still moist as if made within the hour. "Patasola," murmured Mateo, his face gone pale beneath the brown. Marsh knelt, peering closely. "A peccary, perhaps," he said. "The others were washed out by last night's rain." "There was no rain," I said. I had lain awake for hours, listening to the ceaseless insects and the occasional call of a night bird. No rain had fallen. Marsh frowned slightly, but did not answer. Henderson straightened. "We are not here to catalogue every pig that passes," he said. "Mark it if you must, Lennox, and let us move on." I sketched the print in my notebook and measured it with my compass. 7 inches from tip to heel, deeper at the front, as if the weight bore down there. As I wrote, I felt a faint, absurd unease, like that which attends the recollection of some half-forgotten childhood story. I told myself it was merely the influence of the Kofan's superstition. The pattern repeated itself over the following days. At irregular intervals we would find, in mud or soft earth, a single track. Never a pair, never a trail, only one isolated impression. As if some one-footed creature had dropped from the canopy, touched the earth, and leapt away into the air. Once we found such a print upon a patch of sand where no branches overhung. The men muttered. Even Henderson's jaw tightened. We sought rational explanations. Marsh suggested that some animal might favour one leg due to injury, though this did not account for the absence of any other mark. I proposed that the others had been obliterated by passing creatures, though why they had spared only one I could not say. Each explanation satisfied us for an hour or two, until the next solitary print presented itself, as fresh and insolent as the last. At night, the forest silences grew more frequent. There would come, without warning, a sudden cessation of sound, as if all living things held their breath. The first time this occurred while I was on watch, I felt the hair upon my arms lift. The lantern's flame guttered slightly, as though a draught had passed, though the air around me was as still and thick as ever. In such moments, faint sounds would come from beyond the circle of light. A rustle that was not the wind. A soft, dragging thump, like a sack of grain dropped from a low height. Once I heard, quite distinctly, the sound of humming. A woman's voice, tuneless but intent, as if engaged in some tedious domestic task. The melody was not one I recognized, though it carried a cadence that put me in mind of old Spanish hymns. I told myself it was some night bird or a trick of the blood in my ears. I told myself many things in those days. The micro shock that shattered our complacent routines came around the middle of the third week, when we had established a more permanent camp near a fork in the river that Marsh wished to study. We had rigged a tarpaulin shelter for our instruments and erected a crude table from saplings. The work that day had been methodical. Angles taken, distances measured, notes entered in careful script. The sun was high, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and our own sweat. I was bent over the theodolite, aligning it with a marked tree, when the instrument's field of view, which had until then contained only the expected tangle of trunks and leaves, was suddenly filled by a human eye. It was so abrupt that I jerked back, striking my head upon the tripod. For an instant, before the instrument toppled, I saw it clearly. An eye, dark and glossy, framed not by skin, but by something like bark and hair. It was impossibly close, as if pressed against the lens from the other side. Then the theodolite crashed to the ground. My view was filled with the ordinary forest, and the spell broke. "What in God's name are you about, Lennox?" Henderson barked, rushing over. I stared at the fallen instrument, my heart pounding. The glass was cracked. My hands trembled as I righted it. There was no one near the far marker, no sign of any intruder. The forest stood as it had all day, indifferent and inscrutable. I thought I saw... I began, then stopped. What could I say? That the jungle had looked back at me? Marsh examined the shattered lens. "You must have knocked it," he said. "Careless, Lennox. These things are not easily replaced." The others went back to their tasks. I wiped my face, which had grown clammy, and told myself that the heat and the close work had strained my eyes. Yet I could not shake the conviction that, for a moment, something had regarded me with a cold, appraising intelligence. That night, the forest did not merely fall silent. It seemed to lean inward. The air grew heavy, and a faint, sweet odor drifted through camp, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The men whispered. One of the mules began to stamp and snort, eyes rolling white. We were woken before dawn by a shout. It was Wilkes. His hammock, which had hung between two stout trees at the edge of the circle, was empty. His boots lay neatly side by side beneath it. One of the lanterns nearby had been extinguished. We fanned out with lanterns and rifles, calling his name. The beam of my lamp caught upon something in the leaf litter, a single, deep, cloven print, pressed into the soft earth just beyond the line where our fire's light had reached. Beside it, half buried in the mulch, lay Wilkes's pipe, the one his sister had given him. The bowl was cracked clean in two. There were no other tracks, no sign of struggle, no blood. "He has gone to the river," said Henderson, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sleepwalking, perhaps. We will find him there." We did not. We searched until the sun was high and the heat oppressive, combing the undergrowth, calling until our throats were raw. Mateo and Isidro moved with desperate speed, their eyes scanning the ground. At last they stopped by a tangle of roots and conferred in low, urgent tones. "What is it?" I asked. Isidro looked at me, his face drawn. "She has taken him," he said simply. "Do not start that," snapped Henderson. "The boy has lost his way, that is all. We will widen the search." But by evening there was still no sign of Wilkes. The river gave back nothing. The men grew sullen and afraid. Marsh muttered about jaguars, though he could produce no spoor to support this. I sat by the fire, turning Wilkes's broken pipe in my hand, and thought of the yew tree in Sussex. The jungle pressed close. Its sounds now a mockery. That night, as we huddled in a tighter circle than before, the singing began. It came from beyond the lanterns, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, low and coaxing, rising and falling on a melody that danced just beyond comprehension. It was not in Spanish, nor in any indigenous tongue I knew. Yet there were fragments that seemed almost familiar, as if drawn from some childhood lullaby, and twisted into a new shape. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "Silence," hissed Henderson, his hand white upon his rifle. The voice drew nearer. Between phrases there came a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy hopping through the undergrowth. The fires flickered, their smoke drawn sideways as if by a passing body. The sweet, rotten scent intensified, mingled now with a faint iron tang that made me think, absurdly, of a butcher's shop. Then, from the darkness, came a second voice, higher, tremulous, unmistakably human. "Arthur," it called. "Is that you?" It was Wilkes. I froze. The voice sounded strained, as if he spoke through clenched teeth, but it was his. There was a rustle, a thump, and then, just beyond the reach of the nearest lantern, a pale shape moved between the trees. "Do not move," whispered Mateo. His hand closed on my arm with surprising strength. "Wilkes," Henderson called. "Come into the light, man." There was a pause. When the boy spoke again, his tone was wrong, too smooth, as if someone else wore his mouth. "Come to me," he said. "It is safe here." Something about the cadence made my skin crawl. The Kofan men began to murmur prayers. Marsh's breath came fast beside me. "Show yourself," Henderson barked. "Step forward, or by God I will." The thing stepped into the light. I say thing, because though it wore a woman's form from the waist up, no man of sound mind would have called it human. Her skin was pale beneath a sheen of moisture, as if she'd been standing in rain that we had not felt. Her hair hung in black ropes, tangled with leaves and what might have been twigs or small bones. Her face, at first glance comely, shifted subtly as I watched, the features arranging themselves into several different women I had known, none of them quite right. Her eyes were large and dark, with a depth that suggested not kindness, but hunger. From the waist down, she was a grotesque parody of a deer. Her hips narrowed to a single, powerful thigh, corded with muscle, ending in a great cloven hoof that dug into the earth with each movement. The leg twitched restlessly, as if eager to leap. Where a second leg should have been there was only smooth, scarred flesh, as if something had been torn away long ago. She smiled, and the expression revealed teeth too many and too sharp for a human mouth. Behind her, half hidden by her hair, I saw Wilkes. Or rather, I saw his face, pressed against the side of her neck, his eyes wide and unseeing. His body was twisted at an impossible angle, his limbs trailing behind her like those of a discarded puppet. One of his hands twitched feebly. I could not breathe. My mind rebelled, insisting upon some rational explanation. A fever vision, a hallucination brought on by bad water. Yet the smell of her, the sound of that dragging hoof, the sight of Wilkes's pipe still in my pocket, all insisted upon her dreadful reality. She spoke again, and this time her voice was not Wilkes's, nor the singing woman's, but a chorus of tones, some high, some low, as if many throats spoke through one mouth. "You called his name," she said. "So I brought him." Mateo fired first. His shot took her in the chest. The impact jerked her backward, but no blood flowed. Instead, a dark, viscous sap oozed from the wound, smelling of rot and something sweet. She laughed, a sound like glass breaking, and sprang. For a creature with only one leg, her speed was impossible. She crossed the space between us in 2 great bounds, her hoof striking sparks from a stone. Men shouted, rifles cracked, lanterns swung wildly. I remember the heat of her passing, as if a furnace had moved through the camp. I remember the brush of hair against my face, cold and wet. I remember the sound of bones snapping and a scream cut short. Then she was gone, vanished into the darkness with a single, powerful leap that carried her beyond the reach of our firelight. The forest erupted in a chaos of sound, birds shrieking, monkeys crashing through trees, the distant roar of some unseen beast. Our camp lay in ruin. One of the tents smoldered. A lantern lay shattered, its oil feeding a small, hungry flame. And on the ground where she had stood, there was a deep, solitary hoofprint, pressed so far into the earth that water had already begun to seep into it. Beside it lay Henderson, his neck twisted, his eyes staring at nothing. Wilkes was nowhere to be seen. The immediate aftermath was a blur of shouting and smoke. We stamped out the spreading fire with our boots and what blankets we could spare. 2 of the local men had fled into the night and did not return. Ruiz knelt by Henderson, his hands shaking. "He is gone," he said unnecessarily. Marsh was on his knees, retching. Mateo and Isidro moved about the perimeter with frantic energy, muttering prayers, checking the trees as if expecting her to drop upon us from above. "We must leave," said Mateo at last, his voice hoarse. "Now, before dawn." "Leave?" Marsh stared at him, wild-eyed. "We have no bearings. No, we cannot simply blunder about in the dark." "She hunts in the dark," said Isidro. "In the day she sleeps. If we wait, she will come back when the fires die." I found my own voice. "Our instruments, our notes." "Damn the instruments," snapped Marsh. You saw that thing." We argued in low, urgent tones, but in truth there was little debate. The men were already gathering what they could carry. We abandoned one of the heavier crates and Henderson's beloved phonograph. I took only my notebooks, the sextant, and a single theodolite that had escaped damage. The rest we left strewn about the ruined camp, mute offerings to whatever watched from the trees. We set out before dawn, the forest still shrouded in a grey gloom. The air felt thicker, as if infused with some invisible presence. Every snapped twig made us start. The Kofan brothers led the way, moving with reckless speed, their usual caution abandoned in favor of escape. Our progress was clumsy by comparison. We stumbled, cursed, and fell, our packs catching on thorns. No one spoke of what we had seen. It lay between us like a shared madness. To name it aloud would be to make it solid, to admit that the world was not as we had believed. Around mid-morning, we came upon one of the men who had fled in the night. He lay at the foot of a great saber tree, his body unmarked, save for the expression upon his face, which was one of such terror that I looked away. His eyes were wide, his mouth stretched in a silent scream. His feet were bare. In the earth beside him was a single deep hoofprint. We did not stop. Mateo murmured a brief prayer as we passed. The sun climbed. The heat grew oppressive, but a chill had settled in my bones that no tropical sun could dispel. Animals avoided us. Once, as we crossed a small clearing, a troop of howler monkeys in the canopy above fell suddenly silent and fled in the opposite direction, their cries fading into the distance. Birds took wing at our approach, though we moved as quietly as we could. It was as if some taint clung to us, some scent that told the creatures of the forest that we had brushed against something that did not belong. By the second day of our retreat, our water ran low. We dared not linger long at streams, for the forest's silences seemed to gather most thickly near water. Once, as we knelt to fill our canteens, that sweet, rotten smell drifted downriver. The surface of the water trembled, though no wind stirred the trees. We moved on, our thirst a lesser fear. At night, we did not make full camp. We found what high ground we could and huddled together, keeping only the smallest of fires, more for our own nerves than for any practical defense. Sleep came in snatches. More than once I woke to the sound of distant singing, so faint I could almost persuade myself it was the wind. Once I felt a pressure upon the ground, a subtle tremor, as if some heavy thing had landed not far off, and then the soft, irregular thump of that single hoof moving away. On the third night of our flight, Ruiz broke. We had stopped beneath a stand of palms, too exhausted to go further. The men lay in a ragged heap, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. I sat with my back against a tree, my rifle across my knees, listening to the forest's uneasy murmurs. Ruiz, who had been unusually quiet since Henderson's death, suddenly rose and began to walk toward the darkness beyond our meager circle of light. "Where are you going?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. He did not answer. His eyes were unfocused, his lips moving soundlessly. I rose and caught his arm. His skin was clammy. "Leave me," he whispered. "She calls. I must." His gaze fixed on something beyond me, and his expression softened, almost beatific. "Mother," he breathed. I slapped him, hard. The sound cracked like a rifle shot. His eyes cleared. For a moment he stared at me, then shuddered and collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Mateo and Isidro came and bound his wrists loosely, not to punish, but to prevent him wandering. No one reproached me for the blow. We reached the river on the 5th day. The sight of that broad, muddy ribbon was more beautiful to me than any cathedral. Our launch, which we had left moored with 2 men to guard it, was still there, though one of the guards was missing. The other, a taciturn fellow named Gomez, sat upon an upturned crate, staring at the water with hollow eyes. "She came to the bank 2 nights ago," he said without preamble as we staggered aboard. I did not move. I did not breathe. She sang to me, but I put mud in my ears. He tapped the side of his head. "She went away. The other one. He went with her." We cast off with fumbling haste, the engine coughing before catching. As the launch pulled away from the bank, I saw, half hidden among the roots of a great tree, a single hoofprint pressed into the soft mud, already filling with the river's seepage. The journey downriver passed in a numb blur. The jungle slipped by, green and impenetrable. Marsh sat with his hands upon his knees, staring straight ahead. Mateo and Isidro spoke little, their faces set. Ruiz muttered prayers under his breath. At night, we anchored midstream, unwilling to risk the shore. The singing did not follow us onto the water, but once, as I stood alone at the stern, I heard, far off, a single hollow thump, as of a hoof striking a fallen log. When at last we reached Puerto Asís, the bustle of the small port town struck me as both jarring and unreal. Men shouted, children ran, women carried baskets of plantains upon their heads. The smell of fish and tar and human habitation filled the air. It felt like a different world, one in which the notion of a one-legged forest siren was absurd. Our appearance caused a stir. We had left with 14 men and returned with 8. Henderson, the expedition's leader, was absent. Wilkes was gone. 2 of the local men had vanished. We were filthy, gaunt and hollow-eyed. The local commandante, a stout man named Ortega, received us in his office, a room of peeling plaster and a single slow fan. He listened to our halting account with a frown. "Jaguars," he said at last, when we had finished a version of events that stopped short of the impossible. "The jungle takes men, it is known. Jaguars do not leave men unmarked," I said before I could stop myself. "They do not sing." Ortega's gaze hardened. "Senor Lennox, I'm sorry for your losses, but if you tell Bogota that monsters stole your men, they will laugh. They will say you were drunk or afraid. They will say the English cannot handle our forest." He spread his hands. "Is that what you wish?" We retired to our lodgings to draft our official report. It was an odd, stilted process, like writing a fiction one knows to be a lie. We sat around a rough table, the lamplight yellow upon the paper, and chose our words with care. On the night of August 3rd, I wrote, "Mr. Wilkes was discovered missing from his hammock. A search of the surrounding area revealed no sign of struggle. It is presumed that he left the camp, possibly in a somnambulant state, and lost his way. Subsequent attempts to locate him were unsuccessful." Of Henderson's death, I wrote, "Captain Henderson was killed during an encounter with a large predator, species uncertain, which entered the camp shortly before dawn. In the ensuing confusion, the animal inflicted fatal injuries before being driven off by rifle fire. There was no mention of a woman with a single hoof, no description of sap that smelled of rot, or of voices that were not their own. We agreed, without quite saying so, that such things would not be believed, and that even if they were, they would serve no purpose but to brand us as untrustworthy witnesses. Yet we could not quite bring ourselves to erase all trace of the inexplicable. In a footnote, almost an afterthought, I added, "It is worth remarking that the local Kofan guides expressed a marked reluctance to approach certain regions of the forest, citing traditional beliefs regarding a female spirit said to prey upon solitary men. While such accounts must be regarded with skepticism, they may influence the conduct of native personnel and thus warrant consideration in future expeditions." That was all. A single, bloodless line in an otherwise dry document. The Royal Geographical Society published a brief notice of our expedition the following year, praising our valuable preliminary surveys and lamenting the regrettable loss of Captain Henderson and Mr. Wilkes to accidents of the terrain and the hazards inherent in tropical exploration. No mention was made of La Patasola. In the years that followed, life resumed its outward course. I married. I took part in other surveys in Africa and Asia. My name appeared in respectable journals. I dined at good tables and spoke of rivers and mountains and the admirable resilience of native porters. Yet the forest never quite released me. The first scene that returns to me when I think of that time occurred in London in the winter of 1919. I was walking along the embankment at dusk, the river grey and swollen with rain. The lamps were just being lit, their yellow halos reflected in the water. Somewhere behind me, a woman laughed. There was nothing remarkable about the sound. London was full of laughter then, brittle and too loud as men tried to forget the trenches. Yet, something in the cadence of it, a small rising trill at the end, struck a chord in me that had not been touched in 6 years. The hair upon my arms rose. The smell of coal smoke and the Thames faded. For an instant, I tasted damp earth and that sickly sweetness. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The woman passed me, arm in arm with a soldier, her cheeks flushed with the cold. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes bright, and in that split second, her face seemed to shift, the features blurring into a dozen others. Then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. I stood there until the chill seeped through my coat, my heart hammering as it had in the Selva. The rationale part of my mind knew that it was only a trick of memory, a sound that had brushed against an old wound. Yet another part, quieter but more insistent, whispered that some things, once heard, are never entirely left behind. The second scene took place some years later in Bogota. I had returned to Colombia on business, and out of a morbid curiosity I could not quite justify, sought out Mateo and Isidro. I found Isidro alone in a small village on the edge of the forest. Mateo, he told me, had died of fever 2 winters before. We sat beneath a corrugated iron awning while the rain drummed upon it. Isidro had aged beyond his years. His hair was shot with grey, his hands gnarled. He listened as I spoke, haltingly, of that night in the camp, of Wilkes and Henderson, of the singing. At length, he said, "We told you she was there." "I know," I replied. I did not believe. He shrugged. "Why would you? Your world is full of straight lines and numbers. Ours has other things in it." "Have you seen her since?" I asked, though I was not sure I wished to hear the answer. He was silent for a time. The rain thickened, the air growing cool. At last he said, "No, but I have heard of men who did. A rubber tapper who followed a woman's voice into the trees and was found days later, his hair white. A boy who vanished from a village. A soldier who shot at something in the night and found his bullets in his own leg in the morning." He looked at me, his gaze steady. "She is old, older than your churches, older than our stories. We give her a name so we can speak of her, but she was there before we were, and she will be there when we are gone." "Then what is she?" I asked. It was a foolish question, but it had sat in me for years, like a stone. Isidro smiled without humor. "Does it matter? If you see a jaguar, do you ask what it is, or do you run?" He poured us both a measure of cheap aguardiente. We drank in silence. The rain eased. Somewhere in the forest, a bird called, a long descending note that made my stomach clench. I have tried, in the years since, to fit what I saw into some framework that would render it less monstrous. I have read of mass hallucinations, of the effects of certain fungi upon the brain. I have considered the possibility that we stumbled upon some unknown species of primate, its deformity misinterpreted by our fevered minds. I have even wondered whether some shared guilt over the exploitation of those lands, over the men we lost, conjured a phantom to bear the weight of it. None of these explanations quite suffice. They circle the thing without touching it, like moths around a flame. The memory remains stubbornly concrete. The feel of damp hair against my cheek, the sound of that hoof striking earth, the sight of sap oozing from a bullet wound that did not bleed. I told my wife a version of the story once, leaving out the more outlandish details. She listened politely, then said, "You were very brave. in a tone that suggested she took it for one more of the mild exaggerations men bring home from distant places. I did not press the matter. One does not wish to see doubt in the eyes of those one loves. I corresponded for a time with Marsh. His letters grew shorter as the years passed. He took a post at a museum classifying beetles. In his last letter, written in a shaky hand, he mentioned that he sometimes heard humming in the stacks after closing when no one else was there. "It is probably the pipes," he wrote, "or my own blood. Still, I find myself a hurrying more than a man of my age ought." He died of a stroke in 1932. I attended his funeral. As the organ droned and the vicar spoke of the wonders of God's creation, I found myself listening past the music, straining for a note that did not belong. Once, in a library in Lima, I came across a thin, privately printed volume of local folklore. Among tales of river serpents and mountain spirits, there was a brief account of La Patasola. The author, a priest writing in the 1870s, dismissed her as a cautionary figure invented to keep men from straying too far from their villages. Yet, he added in a footnote, there are those who insist that she is not merely a story, but a remnant of some older thing that has worn many names. They say she dwells in the deep forest and that she hates men who cut and burn. I have not seen her, and I pray I never shall. I closed the book and sat for a long time with it upon my lap, feeling the weight of that slender footnote as keenly as any scientific treatise. In the end, I have come to a kind of uneasy acceptance. There are places in this world where our instruments and our maps are of limited use, where the old stories cling like mist and refuse to be burned away by the light of reason. We may choose to ignore them, to label them superstition, but that does not mean they are wholly without teeth. What disturbs me most, even now, is not the memory of her face or the sound of her voice, but the simple, undeniable fact of those solitary hoofprints. They were there, pressed into mud and sand and riverbank, as real as my own boot marks. They began nowhere and led nowhere. They suggested a way of moving through the world that I cannot comprehend. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just so and the house has settled into its own creaks and sighs, I will hear a faint, irregular thump, as if someone were hopping along the road outside on one heavy foot. I tell myself it is a loose shutter or a branch against the wall. I get up, check the windows, and find nothing. Then I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and think of a circle of lanterns in a distant forest, of a boy who wished to see a yew tree again, and of a single, deep hoofprint slowly filling with dark water while the jungle watched in silence.